Toronto, 2004, a bustling city hiding a mystery that would haunt it for nearly 2 decades. When 29-year-old graphic designer Emily Vargas vanished one quiet autumn evening, her friends thought it was just a misunderstanding. They were wrong. What began as a missing person case soon spiraled into a chilling cold case. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every case deserves to be heard. What investigators uncovered years later would shock everyone. Toronto, 2004. The city was alive with change. New condos rising above Queen Street, streetcars rattling through the West End, and artists carving out their place in its creative heartbeat. Among them was Emily Vargas, a 29-year-old graphic designer known among her peers for her quiet brilliance and meticulous eye for color. She had a way of turning the ordinary into something memorable, a flyer, a mural, a brand logo, each touched with her warmth and precision. Her apartment sat above a small, independent bookstore on a leafy side street not far from Dufferin Grove. The air always smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Her workspace was modest, an old wooden desk, a second-hand computer, and walls pinned with sketches, typography samples, and color swatches. Emily's personal touch was everywhere. A small cactus on the windowsill, a half-finished candle cooling on the counter, jazz music humming softly from her old stereo. She had recently made the leap to full-time freelancing, designing posters for local theater troupes and indie musicians who couldn't afford big agencies but wanted art that spoke to them. It was a risk leaving the stability of her agency job, but Emily had a quiet confidence that carried her through uncertainty. Her clients described her as calm in chaos, someone who could turn stress into something beautiful. Outside of work, Emily's world was grounded in family. Her younger sister, Laura, was her closest friend, a schoolteacher who often visited her in the city on weekends. Together, they'd explore Toronto's hidden corners, vintage stores in Kensington Market, quiet cafes tucked off Queen West, or the waterfront at dusk, where Emily liked to photograph reflections of the skyline. Their mother, widowed when the girls were in high school, lived in Mississauga and often joined them for Sunday dinners. Emily was protective of them both, sending little gifts and notes to remind them she was thinking of them. Friends recall that year as one of transformation for her. Emily had started talking about hosting her first solo art exhibition, a dream she'd held since college. She'd begun organizing her portfolio and networking with gallery owners. Those who knew her best said she radiated a sense of direction, like she was finally stepping into the next phase of her life. The West End neighborhood where she lived was safe, or at least felt that way. People knew each other by name. The cafe owner downstairs kept an eye on the building, and neighbors would exchange pleasantries at the mailboxes. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Yet beneath the surface, big city life carried its own shadows. Police records from that time show a spike in late-night assaults across downtown Toronto, isolated incidents, rarely connected, quickly forgotten. But for someone like Emily, who often walked home after evening client meetings, the streets could turn from familiar to dangerous without warning. Still, no one, not even Emily, seemed to sense danger. Her calendar for October 2004 was filled with normalcy, design deadlines, a birthday dinner for a friend, a note that read, "Art show, final sketches due." She was planning her future one page at a time. Her life was not extraordinary in a cinematic sense, but it was full, vibrant, and real. She was a woman chasing her creative voice in a city that rewarded ambition. To everyone who loved her, Emily Vargas represented light, a steady, kind soul who had finally found her rhythm in the world. And then, without warning, that rhythm stopped. One ordinary evening, one walk home, and Emily would simply vanish. What happened the night Emily Vargas vanished without a trace? October 14th, 2004, the day that would divide the Vargas family's life into a before and an after. It was a mild autumn Thursday in Toronto. The air was crisp. The streets glowed with the last golden traces of daylight, and people hurried through the city's West End as dusk settled. For Emily Vargas, the day began like any other. She woke early, answered a few client emails, and worked from her apartment on a poster design for a local theater company's winter production. She was on a tight deadline, but by 5:42 p.m., she sent off the final draft with her usual professional note. "Hope this fits your vision. Let's discuss details tomorrow." A friend texted her around 6 p.m., suggesting they grab coffee at a small cafe off Queen Street West. Emily replied with a thumbs-up emoji and, according to digital records later retrieved by police, opened a new sketch file on her laptop moments before she shut it down. She slipped on her favorite red scarf, a handmade piece gifted by her mother, grabbed her sketchbook and left her apartment. Surveillance footage from a neighboring building captured her descending the front steps at 6:10 p.m., a messenger bag slung across her shoulder. Her pace was relaxed, confident. She appeared unaware that anyone might be watching. She never made it to the cafe. When she didn't respond to messages that night, her friend assumed she'd gotten caught up with work or run into someone she knew. Emily was social that way. But when she missed a morning meeting the next day and failed to answer calls from both clients and family, unease began to spread. By Friday evening, her sister Laura drove from Mississauga to check on her. Emily's car was still parked out front. The apartment door was locked. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the cursor blinking on a blank page. Her phone was plugged into the charger. Her coat hung neatly on the rack. The only thing missing was her purse, her sketchbook, and the red scarf she'd been wearing. Laura called police. Officers arrived that night to take an initial report. Because there was no evidence of a struggle or forced entry, it was treated first as a possible voluntary disappearance. But Laura knew instantly that wasn't right. Emily wouldn't just walk away, she told them. She's the most dependable person I know. By Saturday morning, the case had escalated. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, checking nearby businesses for security footage. Only one camera, the same one from the building next door, caught Emily leaving. Beyond that, she vanished into the Toronto night. Her disappearance quickly made local news. Newspapers ran headlines like "The Vanished Artist Toronto Woman Missing Without a Trace." Friends, co-workers, and volunteers printed flyers bearing her photo, warm smile, dark hair, a soft expression, and taped them to street lamps and storefronts across the city. Her family held vigils in Dufferin Grove Park, pleading for information. Days turned into weeks. Leads came and went. Taxi drivers claimed to have seen someone matching her description, but none of it checked out. Police received dozens of tips. A red scarf spotted in a trash bin. A woman seen boarding a late-night bus, but each one dissolved under scrutiny. Meanwhile, investigators quietly gathered evidence from her apartment and surrounding area. Clothing fibers, fingerprints, soil traces from her shoes. At the time, the lab could do little with such partial or degraded samples. What they didn't know was that those faint traces would one day speak louder than any eyewitness ever could. As winter approached, hope began to fade. The posters weathered and tore. Calls stopped coming in. For her family, silence became the loudest sound in the world. When police finally found her, what would they discover about her final moments? It was the morning of November 4th, 2004, 3 weeks since Emily Vargas had vanished, when a jogger cutting through High Park took a turn off the main path. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale light over the trees. The jogger noticed something odd near a wooded ravine, a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed, leaves piled unevenly as if covering something. When he moved closer, the air changed, heavy, still, almost unnatural. What he saw next made him stumble backward and call 911. Within minutes, police cordoned off the area. Beneath the leaves and a thin layer of soil were the remains of a woman. Her red scarf, the same one described in the missing person posters, was still wrapped loosely near her neck. It didn't take long for detectives to realize what they'd found. Toronto's West End, once buzzing with the energy of daily life, fell silent that morning. The name Emily Vargas was no longer associated with hope. It was now tied to tragedy. Detective Alan Rourke from the homicide unit led the team. The scene, he later said, was strange, too clean, too deliberate. There was no evidence of a struggle nearby. Her bag and sketchbook were missing, as was her jewelry. But oddly, her clothing appeared undisturbed, and initial forensics found no clear evidence of sexual assault. Robbery didn't seem to fit either. It was as if whoever was responsible had carefully removed anything that could tell a story. Except one thing: her red scarf. Forensic experts estimated she had died the same night she disappeared. The body showed signs of exposure, but the lack of major trauma puzzled investigators. Toxicology was inconclusive. It wasn't suffocation, stabbing, or blunt force, at least not in any typical sense. It was like she just stopped breathing, one coroner noted. The cause of death would remain officially listed as undetermined pending further results. Emily's family was devastated. Laura, her younger sister, stood outside police headquarters during the first press conference. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My sister didn't deserve this. Somebody out there knows what happened." Her plea echoed across Toronto's news broadcasts that night. Strangers left flowers at the edge of High Park. Candlelight vigils spread from Dufferin Grove to Queen Street. For weeks, posters bearing Emily's face became symbols of fear and unity. As the investigation deepened, detectives combed through her life with clinical precision. They questioned her co-workers at the design studio where she'd once worked, her freelance clients, her friends from art circles, and even old boyfriends. Each interview brought potential and disappointment. The ex-boyfriend had an alibi. Co-workers were out of town. Her building's landlord remembered nothing unusual. No one fit the profile of a killer. Investigators widened the scope, exploring whether Emily had crossed paths with anyone dangerous while working late at cafes or galleries. But again, there was nothing conclusive. Even the jogger who found her was scrutinized, though quickly cleared. Forensic analysis of the area turned up a handful of fibers, but DNA results were partial and unreliable. Behind the scenes, pressure was building. The Toronto press began to criticize the police for lack of progress, suggest incompetence. But privately, detectives admitted they were stumped. There was no narrative, Rourke would later recall. No sign of motive, no sign of opportunity. Just absence. By early winter, the investigation stalled. The file was labeled suspicious death, unresolved. But one detail in the coroner's report went largely unnoticed at first. A faint, smudged mark beneath the edge of Emily's red scarf. It wasn't definitive. It could have been dirt, fabric transfer, or something else entirely. Years later, that tiny, overlooked trace would resurface and challenge everything detectives thought they knew about how Emily died. What hidden detail at the scene would soon challenge everything detectives believed about the case? By early 2005, the Toronto police had poured their hearts and over 3,000 man-hours into the Emily Vargas investigation. What had started as a high-profile missing person case had evolved into a grim homicide probe with no clear answers. Detective Alan Rourke, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, still believed the killer was someone close. Someone who knew Emily's habits, her gentle nature, and her predictable routines. She was careful, he often told his team. Whoever did this knew how to make her feel safe, but the evidence stubbornly refused to cooperate. There was no forced entry at her apartment, no surveillance footage beyond her walking out the door, and no eyewitnesses from the busy Queen Street area. Every known acquaintance was checked, interviewed, and checked again. Yet each path led to nothing, only more dead ends. Rourke and his team began sifting through Emily's client list once more, desperate for a fresh lead. As a freelance designer, she'd worked with dozens of small businesses and individual clients, some local, others remote. Several male clients had grown friendly with her, exchanging late-night emails about design revisions that sometimes strayed into casual conversation. But none had criminal records or violent histories. Their alibis were solid. Their timelines, clean. The detectives brought in a profiler from the Behavioral Sciences Unit. His assessment was grimly unhelpful. This doesn't fit a typical pattern. If it's personal, it's deeply buried. If it's random, it's unusually careful. By February, the case board in the homicide office was a maze of red string and photographs, connecting points that led nowhere. Emily's last known steps, from her apartment to the nearby coffee shop, were documented down to the minute. But what happened after 6:10 p.m. was a complete blank. No cameras, no witnesses, no phone activity. It was as though she'd stepped into a void. Forensics hadn't delivered any breakthroughs either. The fibers collected near her body produced mixed results, too generic to trace. The partial fingerprints on her sketchbook were inconclusive. Technology in 2005 simply wasn't advanced enough to detect the trace DNA fragments that might have identified her killer. "We had everything but the science to read it," one technician later recalled. Desperation led investigators to broaden their search. They interviewed transients and drifters living in shelters and underpasses near High Park, hoping one might have seen something. Some offered vague statements. A scream in the distance, a car speeding away, but none could be corroborated. One lead involved a man reportedly camping in the woods that week, but he was never found. As winter dragged on, public attention began to wane. The nightly news stopped covering Emily's story. Newspapers shifted focus to fresher tragedies. What had once gripped the entire city slowly faded into the background noise of urban life. For Emily's family, time only deepened the wound. Her mother refused to pack away her daughter's belongings. Emily's bedroom remained untouched, her sketchbook still open, her pencils arranged neatly beside the desk. "It still smells like her," her mother whispered to reporters during a brief interview that spring. Laura, her sister, grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. "We gave them everything," she said, "and they still have nothing." Behind closed doors, the Toronto Homicide Unit faced its own frustration. Rourke was forced to admit what no detective ever wants to. The case was stalling. Leads had dried up, public pressure was gone, and funding was being redirected to newer investigations. By the end of March 2005, the official line was simple. The Vargas case remained open but inactive. The evidence sat sealed in a storage room, labeled and cataloged, waiting for a day when technology might finally catch up. What no one knew then was that one small oversight, a missing piece of evidence misplaced during cataloging, would quietly bring the entire investigation to a standstill. When every lead dried up, what would cause this investigation to stall completely? By 2007, the Vargas file had been pushed into the cold case archive, a climate-controlled room in the Toronto Police Headquarters, lined with rows of aging evidence boxes. Each one represented a story unfinished, a name without justice. Among them, a narrow cardboard box labeled Vargas Emily Homicide 2004 gathered dust on the middle shelf. For detectives, it was one of hundreds, but for the Vargas family, it was everything, a wound that refused to heal. Over time, the buzz around Emily's case dimmed. The early years had been filled with vigils, fundraisers, and media coverage. Her photograph, a bright, soft-eyed portrait, once hung in coffee shops and subway stations across the city. But as new cases emerged, her face slowly vanished from Toronto's collective memory. Only her family, and one detective, refused to let her disappear completely. Laura Vargas, Emily's younger sister, became a voice for the voiceless. Determined to turn pain into purpose, she joined advocacy groups for missing persons and cold case reform. She spoke at police conferences and public rallies, urging departments to prioritize forgotten victims. "A case isn't cold," she once said during a televised interview. "It's just waiting for someone to care again." Her passion gained attention, but not results. Inside the Toronto Police Service, Detective Alan Rourke couldn't let it go either. Though officially reassigned to new investigations, he kept a copy of Emily's file tucked in his desk drawer. Every few months, he'd flip through it again, hoping something might stand out with fresh eyes. Something about her case never sat right, he later admitted in an interview. It was too clean, too deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly what not to leave behind. By 2010, the trail was stone cold. Witnesses had moved away or forgotten details. Some files had been misfiled or degraded. Forensic technology had advanced rapidly, but budgets hadn't. Retesting evidence from old cases was costly, and the department's resources were stretched thin. The High Park crime scene photos, faded but haunting, were all that remained tangible. The soil samples, fibers, and fingernail scrapings collected in 2004 still sat sealed in evidence lockers. But time had taken its toll. DNA traces were fragile, samples were limited. Without funding or a solid lead, reopening the Vargas case seemed impossible. Still, Laura kept fighting. Every October, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, she would hold a small vigil in front of the old bookstore, where her sister once lived above. Neighbors changed, the storefront shuttered, and the mural Emily had helped paint on the brick wall faded into peeling fragments. Yet Laura stood there, candle in hand, whispering her sister's name to the cold Toronto air. By 2015, the investigation reached its 10-year mark. For the first time, the Toronto Cold Case Unit began quietly revisiting select unsolved murders using new DNA sequencing technologies. methods far more sensitive than those available in 2004. But budget constraints limited the effort to only the most high-profile cases. Emily's wasn't one of them. Then, in 2018, a small miracle occurred. A private donation from an anonymous benefactor supporting forensic innovation provided new funding to test dormant evidence in unsolved homicides. The Vargas file was chosen almost by chance as part of the second review wave. Detective Rourke, now nearing retirement, was informed that Emily's samples would finally be re-examined using modern DNA amplification. This meant testing fragments so small they had once been considered useless. The hope was slim, but for the first time in over a decade, the case flickered with possibility. That spring, forensic analysts began unpacking Emily's sealed evidence kit. Inside were the same fibers, the same soil, the same faint traces that had baffled investigators years before. Only now, the technology could see what human eyes and old machines never could. What would modern DNA testing uncover that investigators missed all those years ago? By early 2019, the Toronto Cold Case Unit had quietly reopened the Emily Vargas investigation. Advances in forensic technology were transforming how old evidence could speak again. The Vargas file, long shelved in the archives, was now back under the fluorescent lights of a modern lab. It was assigned to Priya Desai, a young forensic biologist known for her precision and relentless curiosity. She specialized in next-generation DNA sequencing, a process capable of extracting viable genetic information from samples once considered too degraded to test. Priya began her work in February, carefully unsealing each evidence envelope collected in 2004. The red scarf, still folded in its protective wrap, caught her attention. It had always been a central piece of the case. Emily had been last seen wearing it, and it was the item that confirmed her identity when her body was discovered. The scarf had been tested before, but early 2000s technology was crude by comparison. Priya decided to run the sample again using ultra-sensitive mitochondrial analysis, hoping it might reveal something new. Weeks passed. Then, late one night, in March, a faint digital blip appeared on her sequencing monitor. A partial male DNA profile, barely detectable but distinct. It was found on the inner weave of the scarf, consistent with skin cell transfer. It wasn't enough for a full profile, but enough for comparison. When Priya reviewed the results again the next morning, she knew she'd uncovered something potentially groundbreaking. The Cold Case Unit immediately forwarded the sample to the National DNA Databank of Canada. For days, investigators waited. Then came the alert. A match. The DNA linked to a man who had been arrested years later for an unrelated assault case in Ontario. He was not convicted, but his genetic information had been legally stored in the database. The name stunned investigators and would later shock the city. The suspect, whose identity remained confidential until arrest, had lived only 4 blocks from Emily's apartment in 2004. At the time of her disappearance, he was a 32-year-old construction worker with no known connection to her. He'd moved away from Toronto just months after the murder. Detectives began reassembling the past piece by piece. They pulled archived tenant records, tracked down old neighbors, and combed through any available CCTV footage still retained from nearby businesses. One surviving clip from a late-night street camera showed a figure matching the suspect's description, walking westbound near Queen Street, just 10 minutes after Emily was last seen leaving her building. It was grainy, barely usable, but it fit the timeline. Detective Alan Rourke, who had followed the case for 15 years, couldn't hide his emotion. "We always believed the answer was in the evidence," he told the team. "We just needed the tools to hear it." Over the next several months, the unit worked quietly, determined not to alert the suspect. They confirmed his employment records, movements, and travel history from 2004 to 2019. Each new piece painted the same haunting picture. He had been living near Emily, frequented the same cafes, and had once been seen browsing in the bookstore below her apartment. The emotional weight of the breakthrough hit hardest for Laura Vargas. When Rourke called her with the update, his voice was steady but heavy. "Laura," he said, "after all these years, We might know who did this." She was silent for a long time before whispering, "Please tell me you're sure." Rourke paused. "We're not there yet, but we're close." That summer, Toronto detectives began the delicate process of surveillance and confirmation. They gathered fresh DNA from the suspect through a discarded item, testing it against the original sample from Emily's scarf. When the results came back, it was an exact match. When police finally knocked on the suspect's door, what would they discover about his connection to Emily? On a cold gray morning in February 2020, the streets of Etobicoke were dusted with snow when a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into a modest suburban block. Inside one of those homes lived Michael Trent, the man whose DNA had been linked to the 2004 murder of Emily Vargas. At 6:15 a.m., detectives from the Toronto Police Homicide and Cold Case Unit surrounded the two-story townhouse. The calm suburban silence broke as officers moved in. "Michael Trent, this is the Toronto Police," a voice commanded through a loudspeaker. Within moments, the front door opened. A man emerged, bleary-eyed, wearing a worn flannel robe. He raised his hands slowly, confusion and resignation mingling in his face. Neighbors peered from their windows, stunned. Trent had lived there for nearly a decade, working as a delivery driver for a logistics company. To them, he was quiet, polite, and unremarkable. The kind of person who kept to himself, one resident later told reporters. But as investigators would soon learn, his past told a very different story. At police headquarters, Trent sat in a small interrogation room under fluorescent lights. Across from him was Detective Alan Rourke, the man who had followed Emily's case since day one. Rourke had waited 16 years for this moment. When asked about Emily Vargas, Trent was quick to deny any connection. "I don't know who that is," he said calmly, eyes fixed on the table. He claimed he'd never seen or met her, insisting there must have been a mistake in the lab. But investigators had already built a timeline that made denial impossible. Back in 2004, Trent had worked as a delivery driver servicing small businesses along Queen Street West, just blocks from Emily's apartment. Old company logs, recovered through archived databases, placed him near her address around 6:30 p.m. on October 14th, the very evening she vanished. The discovery was damning. Detectives also found fiber traces on Emily's red scarf that matched the material of Trent's old work uniform. Combined with the DNA profile from the same scarf, the evidence formed a chilling narrative. Trent had likely crossed paths with Emily that night while completing his deliveries, followed her home, and attacked her in a moment of opportunity. Still, Rourke and his team were careful. They knew a 16-year-old case would face intense scrutiny in court. Every piece of evidence had to withstand the defense's inevitable challenge. They secured search warrants for Trent's property, seizing old uniforms, electronics, and archived employment records. Forensic analysts confirmed consistent trace matches across multiple samples. The arrest made national headlines. "Toronto 2004 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community," read one front-page headline. The city was stunned to learn that a man who'd lived among them for years, shopping at the same stores, attending local events, had allegedly taken the life of a young artist whose case had haunted Toronto for nearly 2 decades. At a press conference, Detective Rourke stood beside Emily's family as the news broke. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Laura Vargas, now in her mid-30s, stepped forward to speak through tears. "We waited 16 years for this moment," she said. Emily's story mattered. She mattered. Behind the relief, there was still unease. Trent's arrest brought long-awaited answers, but it also reopened old wounds. Some neighbors struggled with guilt, wondering if they had ever missed signs of darkness. Others questioned how a man with prior harassment complaints, ones that never led to charges, had managed to slip through the cracks for so long. In court documents, those complaints painted a disturbing pattern. Women followed, co-workers unsettled, boundaries blurred. Yet none of it had been enough for prosecution back then. Now, for the first time, the weight of justice seemed to tilt in Emily's favor. But as pretrial hearings began, defense attorneys prepared to challenge the credibility of the aged DNA evidence, the chain of custody, and even the interpretation of the forensic match. The Vargas family braced themselves once more, this time for the emotional storm of the courtroom. As the trial began, would the evidence be strong enough to finally secure justice for Emily? In early 2022, after nearly 2 years of pretrial motions, the case of the Crown versus Michael Trent finally reached the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. It was one of the most anticipated trials in recent Toronto history, a chance to finally close the chapter on a cold case that had haunted the city for almost 2 decades. From the moment jury selection began, reporters filled the courthouse steps. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and members of the public packed the gallery daily. For the Vargas family, it was both a moment of reckoning and an emotional ordeal. Laura and her mother took their seats every morning in the second row, clutching each other's hands as the trial began. The prosecution's case was clear and methodical. Led by Crown Attorney Michelle Gordon, they presented the DNA match as irrefutable proof of Trent's guilt. Gordon walked the jury through the timeline, from Emily's last sighting on October 14, 2004, to the breakthrough in 2019 when forensic technology detected the partial male DNA on her red scarf. She explained how new next-generation sequencing methods made it possible to identify even degraded genetic material without contamination. To strengthen the case, she introduced delivery logs from Trent's 2004 route, placing him within a 3-block radius of Emily's apartment around the time of her disappearance. The courtroom listened as witnesses testified. A former co-worker of Trent described him as friendly but sometimes unpredictable, recalling an incident where he followed a female colleague home after work. Another witness, a retired shop owner from Queen Street, remembered seeing a man resembling Trent loitering outside the bookstore below Emily's apartment that same week. But the defense pushed back hard. Defense attorney Mark Fallon argued that the DNA evidence was unreliable due to the sample's age and possible contamination during earlier storage. He reminded jurors that the evidence had been collected in 2004, a time when forensic preservation standards were not as advanced as today's. "We're not talking about a fresh case," he said during opening statements. "We're talking about old evidence touched by many hands, processed by old tools, and revived by new ones. That's a dangerous precedent." Fallon also attacked the circumstantial links, suggesting that Trent's job naturally placed him near Emily's neighborhood and that his proximity was coincidence, not proof of guilt. He called the case a puzzle built on dust. To counter this, the prosecution called forensic expert Priya Desai to the stand. Calm and precise, she explained how next-generation sequencing isolates DNA fragments at a molecular level, effectively ruling out contamination. "The technology does not assume," she told the jury. It reads. Her testimony became one of the most pivotal moments of the trial. For days, the courtroom heard technical jargon, emotional testimonies, and the haunting retelling of Emily's final night. Through it all, Laura Vargas sat silently, her grief tempered by determination. When the prosecution displayed Emily's red scarf, the key piece of evidence, she quietly reached for her mother's hand. After 3 weeks of testimony and cross-examinations, both sides rested. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours turned into days. On the third day, word spread that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled to capacity. When the jury foreperson stood, the air was electric. The words came slowly, heavy with history. "Guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Michael Trent showed no emotion, staring blankly ahead as the judge pronounced his sentence. Life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 15 years. Outside the courthouse, Laura faced the press through tears. "This doesn't bring Emily back," she said, voice trembling, "but it brings her peace. And it reminds us that time doesn't erase truth." The verdict marked the end of a long, painful journey, but it also sparked new questions across Toronto's law enforcement and public. How many other victims like Emily still waited in the silence of forgotten files, their stories untold, their justice delayed? What lasting impact would this case leave on Toronto and its fight for victims forgotten by time? In the years following Michael Trent's conviction, the story of Emily Vargas grew beyond a single case. It became a national symbol of persistence, proof that time could not bury truth. What began as a local tragedy in Toronto's West End transformed into a catalyst for systemic change across Canada's approach to cold case investigations. Emily's name started appearing not only in newspapers but in conferences, policy discussions, and training programs for new detectives. The Toronto Police Service, moved by the outcome and public support surrounding the Vargas investigation, announced a major expansion of its cold case unit in 2023. The department secured new funding to re-examine evidence using modern DNA and genealogy techniques. What had once been a small, underfunded division became a specialized task force, a testament to what one solved case could inspire. Detective Alan Rourke, who retired shortly after the trial, was invited back to consult on procedural reform. In interviews, he often credited Laura Vargas for her persistence. She refused to let her sister fade into a file number, he said. Because of her, others will now have a second chance at justice. His words resonated deeply with a public weary of hearing about forgotten victims. For Laura, life after the verdict took on new purpose. Grief evolved into advocacy. She founded the Vargas Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families of unsolved cases secure forensic testing for their loved ones. The group raised funds for advanced DNA analysis, supported by both public donations and private grants. Within its first year, it assisted in reopening 4 cold cases across Ontario. Laura often described her mission as passing forward the miracle that saved Emily's case. She visited schools, universities, and community events, speaking about the power of persistence and the importance of science and justice. "Every sample tells a story," she said in one televised interview. "Sometimes it just takes time, and someone who refuses to stop asking." The Toronto art community also found a way to honor Emily's memory. Friends and former clients organized an annual event called the Red Scarf Exhibit, a series of art installations dedicated to women's safety, creativity, and resilience. The exhibit's name, inspired by the scarf that once symbolized tragedy, became a beacon of remembrance and hope. Artists from across Canada contributed work centered on healing and empowerment, the kind of event Emily herself had once dreamed of curating. In 2024, the City of Toronto unveiled a small memorial plaque in High Park, near the wooded area where Emily was found. It read, "In memory of Emily Vargas, artist, daughter, sister, may her story remind us that time may pass but justice endures." Visitors often leave candles, sketches, or red ribbons tied to nearby trees. For some, it's a place of quiet reflection. For others, a reminder of what determination and science can achieve when combined. Media retrospectives frequently revisit the case, examining how a single discovery, a microscopic DNA fragment, unraveled 16 years of mystery. Forensic experts cite it as a turning point that emphasized the value of evidence, preservation, and ongoing technological advancement. The Vargas case also influenced legislative discussions in Ontario about the funding and management of cold case units. Proposals emerged to create a national framework ensuring that unsolved cases receive periodic forensic reviews as technologies improve. But beyond policy and reform, Emily's story left a more personal legacy, one of remembrance and resilience. Her family, once defined by grief, became champions of hope. Her name became more than a headline. It became a symbol of faith and justice, no matter how long it takes. As Laura often says, standing at her sister's memorial, justice doesn't expire. It just waits for someone to find it. In the end, what does Emily Vargas' story teach us about time, truth, and the human will to remember?